It happens very frequently that I will be watching a YouTube video about some lighthearted and unserious topic, superhero films, all manners of things, and then suddenly the person who made the YouTube video will feel the need to insert their political opinion, an opinion that had nothing to do with the topic and is presented so abrasively and aggressively that it just makes me ask what the point was. So we will be discussing things relating to politics today, but this is not a political discussion, this is discussion about political discussion. But given the nature of the questions I ultimately want to build to answering, I feel a bit of preamble or setting the stage is appropriate for this discussion. There's an old allegory from India, centuries old, that I've been told from both Buddhists and Hindus, which goes something like this. There is a group of men either blind or are in a pitch-black cave, so they cannot see a thing as if they were blind. And there's something with the blind men or something in the cave which they cannot see and must feel. So these men all felt the unknowable thing, and then they were asked by a king to describe what they had encountered, and so they went one by one. The first man explaining he felt something wide and round like a large pot. The next man disagreeing, he felt something broad and soft like a fan or broad leaves. The next man disagreed, he felt something sharp and strong like a plowshare. The next man disagreed, he felt something long and writhing like a snake. The next man corrected him, he felt something bulky and broad like the wall of a storehouse. The next man countered, he felt something round and strong like a pillar. The next man disagreed, he felt something bristly and soft like a broom. All the men had felt the very same thing, but they had all only felt an individual piece of a massive whole, as each man had felt body parts of an elephant. In the Buddhist telling of the story, the Buddha explains that the limited perspectives that each of the men had on this unknowable giant beast represent the limited perspectives of the worldly that different philosophies hold. This metaphor holds incredible appeal to me, and I often think of it in comparison to a similar metaphor that might be more familiar to viewers. In the ancient Greek Plato's metaphor of the men in the cave, a group of men are chained inside of a cave underneath an overlook so that they cannot see out of the cave, but so that things outside of the cave can cast shadows on the wall. One day, one of the men in this cave is able to escape, and he makes his way out to the world. In the cave, all the men ever see are shadows on the wall, so they come to conceptualize the world in 2 dimensions. And as the man makes his way out of the cave, everything he's ever known is rewritten. And as he makes his way back to the cave to tell the other prisoners about what he's seen, he can't find the words to tell them, and they can't find any way to believe him, because the world outside of the cave is simply unknowable to them. At their cores, both of these stories tackle similar themes of the nature of reality being bigger than what individual perspectives know. In the Indian story, the blind men who all feel the elephant are supposed to be you and me, the average person, and only the truly enlightened master is able to conceive of the entire elephant. And it is up to the king or the enlightened person to not only understand the totality of the elephant, but also find a way to explain it to the blind men. That it's the role of the enlightened teacher to not only understand that which is greater, but to be able to communicate it. But of course, any metaphor or parable that talks about caves is a parable that resonates very closely to me. I've had a sort of hyperfixation or obsession with caves and with rocks for most of my life, and that has brought me to spend a lot more time in caves than the average person has, in addition to going in there for my studying, for work, and for recreation. I've also spent a lot of time looking at caving media from other cavers. It's a big interest of mine, and it's something that stands out to me in the wide world of folklore is how much truth there is in folkloric ideas of caves and the underground, even if they are not necessarily immediately scientifically accurate. In the folklore of the Slavs, the underground eventually is the threshold that leads to the underworld. At some point, the surface, which is the lush, vibrant, growing gown of green on the Mother Earth, goes into her soil. The black dirt is the flesh of her body, and that goes down and down, eventually turning into the caves which lead to the underworld. So the moisture of the soil was conceived of as if the moisture in the living body, and eventually they thought all of the moisture would collect into a bottom water, and that this bottom water, the lowest river, would flow into the water in the underground, that there was a river or a waterfall, a whirlpool somewhere in here, that would transfer the living from the world of the above to the below. Nowadays we know that this is, in a sense, true. All groundwater will eventually soak through the ground, through the dirt, through all of the containing aquifers, the impenetrable stones, into the water table. The water table being a material of stone, usually a very porous stone, which carries water within itself. It's not exactly like a sponge, but it works from a similar principle. There is quite literally water in the stone once you go far enough down. All of the water which disappears and seeps into the soil trickles down in little waterfalls and little rivers in caves as the moisture condenses on the walls, but also oozes out of the stone itself, trickles through the softer stone, and flows off of the harder stone, eventually collecting and collecting until you get deep enough down where it's just water. And these big pools of isolated water are where crystals grow. The water, as it seeps off of the cave walls, literally grows like organic hair, the crystals branching off like plants. So literally, the underground world is a place that grows. And inside the deep underground, where it is humid, where it is wet, and where it becomes hot as the air gradually stops circulating, this is a world where entire ecosystems of blind fish and see-through insects thrive off of a pillar with a little bit of moss growing on it. They rely off a still pool of fresh water, the cleanest water in the world. In one cave, a fragile ecosystem in stasis, a bit like a closed womb of the earth, where the life cycles of these cave-dwelling animals can stretch for centuries because their metabolisms are so slow and their lives are so simple. While in another cave at the same depth, the stones emit toxic chemicals which make the water poisonous, so anything that disrupts the water will be suffocated by poisonous gas. The lack of oxygen and the prevalence of gas causes anything that enters it to die. As the lone bat falls on a cave floor and begins to decompose, instead of being eaten by insects, because there are not insects down here, the bat is eaten by the cave itself. The minerals which drip from the cave ceiling fall on the bat, and then another drop and another drop, each depositing a few tiny grains of minerals. And in time, over several dozens or hundreds of years, the minerals bury and consume the animal. So it is that the underground is a place of great life and a place of death and recycling. And the most true thing about the underground that so many ancient people figured out so well is that it simply never ends. As someone goes down so many caves, the cave will keep going. There will be a chamber off of a chamber, and as you pursue it, no matter how tight it gets, no matter how far you've gotten, no matter how far it feels like this must be the end, you've simply gone too far. The cave keeps going. It's so easy to get turned around. As simple as a few hours spent in the cave can see the water of the cave rise, and that water rising just a meter will totally transform the cave. It will bury any footprints you left on your way in. It will leave you completely disoriented. I don't know how long ago it was, but given how many people agree across the world about this, maybe it was one of the first things that people thought. But I can understand so easily that thousands, or maybe millions of years ago, when people went into those caves, and they kept going, and they kept going, and found the strange worlds of watery wombs where crystals grow, they understood that they were inside of something alive, that all of the earth was a living thing that they were inside of, and that if they just kept going, they would end up somewhere else. Of course, nowadays we understand that the somewhere else is not another world. The water will simply keep going down until it can't go down any further, because the stone becomes so compressed that it begins to become plastic, and the plastic stone transitions into magma and the mantle. But nowadays, we also understand that the Earth is very much alive. The entire planet is a moving and living system. The magma like blood in the heart of the planet. The way every last pebble of the Earth's existence is wholly recycled, the same way that every cell in your body is totally replaced every couple decades, perpetually made anew by reforming the same old matter into a new configuration, recycled again and again from where it was first born in the heart of a dying star billions of years ago. Spoken as a geology major, the Earth is not an organic being, but the motion of the Earth can very, very appropriately be called alive in the colloquial sense, and in my opinion, in the spiritual sense. We're often asked something along the lines of, how can polytheism and religion be made compatible with modern science? Or do you have a method for making your polytheist praxis compatible with modern science? And I understand exactly why people want to ask this. They're coming from a background of something like American flavors of Protestant Christianity, where a lot of people intentionally reject science as part of their religion. But I feel difficulty in answering this question as presented because it unintentionally casts a bit of a false dichotomy. For much of history across much of the world, the leading experts of scientific fields were religious people, and they considered what they did to be an extension of their religion. So to say they were getting to know the works of their God. Of course, he had certain things he went through later in his life, but when he made the discovery of evolution by natural selection, Charles Darwin was a devout Christian. Going back further, the concept of genetics, as we understand it now, was discovered by a Christian monk who had an obsession with growing and breeding pea plants, and he observed the traits of heredity within his pea plants. Any Polish person will proudly tell you about Nicholas Copernicus, and while the church did later turn against his findings, he made every discovery he made in interest of understanding the work of the God he believed in, and the initial response within the church, within the first few years, was acceptance and expanding upon it, out of an excitement that they were getting to know the nature of God better before some church politics got in the way of the desire to understand.
Newton was correct, but there was one sticking point. Where does gravity come from? Newton didn't know. So he said, God does it. God sustains gravity through his divine will. You see, nowadays we tend to think of science, theology, and politics as three separate things. But that wasn't how they did it back then. In Newton's time, it was totally normal for a scientist to say, the natural world is like this, and therefore God, who made it, is like that, and therefore society should be like this. Descartes and his followers said God doesn't make mistakes, he doesn't leave gaps in the universe, he designed it perfectly first time. But Newton and his followers said that the existence of empty space allows God the freedom to intervene in the universe if he wants to. I mean, he's God, right? So presumably he can just edit the document as we go.
Religion, much like politics or like science, especially in the first century or two of modern formal science, has been leveraged by dishonest actors to create abusive, dogmatic systems. But the use of these systems by bad actors does not immediately rule out the possibility of a more open-minded and good faith use of these worldviews in the pursuit of understanding the world. The modern scientific method allows many very qualified experts to work together to compare what they've observed about the elephant, and they've been able to come to a much better picture than many people in the past were able to do. But they're still understanding the elephant, and I don't think that we need to discount past observations about the elephant that can still hold a degree of truth. And if we discount past observations, we risk losing things that they saw that the modern people have not seen. For example, I'm often asked about knowledge and myths, and I can't help but launch into my fixation on history and prehistory, which is where I've been educated, the deep, deep past. You can fairly say that this is all completely, purely coincidental, and it very easily could be. But it could also be that ancient people saw what they could of the elephant, and they tried to put it together. And now, in the modern day, we've been able to put it together better. But I don't want to discount the effort that the people in the past made. It's said in Polish folklore that essentially all of life came from the ocean, when God descended from the sky onto the oak boat, and alongside with the devil, they created the earth. earth out of the primordial waters. And from the waters sprouted the earth, and from the earth would sprout all of the vegetation and the growing life. And then God and devil would take turns creating the first life forms, and the first life forms were the lowly things who lived in the waters or at the boundary of the water. This would be fish, amphibians, snakes, the animals of swamps. And in response were made the first birds, the falcons and eagles, and then the storks, herons. So in Polish folklore, the oldest living things are the fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. And after some time, eventually, God would create humanity, and after he created the first humans, his previous creations, the giants, and the half-giants or children of giants, the colossal beings who had shaped the earth for a very long time, decided that they might attack the people and take their land, so God had to dispatch and remove the giants and giant children to make the world safe for humanity. And just as the ancient people understood that the earth was alive, even if they didn't have the theory of tectonic plates yet, I can't help but observe that they were right. The first animals to emerge from the ocean were the amphibians, reptiles, and insects. And in the beginning of the earth, as the plants colonized the land, these swamp-dwelling animals dominated life on earth. And after these swamp-dwelling animals would rise the birds. Specifically, a lineage of reptiles would become a lineage that we call Dinosauria, which would lead to the theropods, then the Manoraptors, and from the Manoraptors would arise the lineage of aves. So the reptiles give rise to the birds. And for a long time, these animals were essentially in control of the earth. It was theirs. But eventually, the giants were killed, and with the giants gone, humanity was able to emerge from a lineage of small rodent-like animals which cowered in fear of the giants, who would then stand upright and make their way towards, ultimately, modern civilization. Since I was asked particularly about philosophy, I'd like to get into contemporary philosophical theory. I'll try to keep it as 101 as I can, but I understand if this feels overly dense, so please feel free to skip to the next video chapter. I adhere to what is sometimes called obligation ethics, a form of contractualism, which in and of itself is semi-Kantian contract theory. We won't linger on aspects about moral obligations to other people, but instead focus on how it relates to understanding reality, or introductory metaphysics. The moral actor is unaware of what true or real consequences will arise from their actions. True reality is unknowable until it happens. But the moral actor has an expectation of what their actions might cause, built from past experience and societal wisdom. So the moral actor weighs this expectation against their internal desires and wants, judging them to be permissible or impermissible. And even if they deem this want impermissible, the swelling of wanting, which becomes a material physical action, is the expression of will. This will affects the external world, and this will can be good or ill, depending on the mathematics carried out in evaluating it. This process can be extrapolated and calculated logically. As Kant said, a good will is good, not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. If with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, not to be sure a mere wish, but the summoning of all means in our power, then, like a jewel, the will would still shine by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add nor take away anything from this value. The will is judged according to governmental law and also to laws of society, which can range from multi-continental cultural spheres down to local communities, and this is often the primary criteria we rely on. We compare our wants and desires versus the law of governments and the law of societies. And in taking part in governments and in societies, we agree to a type of contract that we are obligated to follow what we understand to be the correct expressions of will. And then there is natural law, understanding the natural to be something objective, fundamental, the thing which all cultures chase and strive to reproduce. The philosopher seeks to understand the natural law with ration so he can teach it. Religion itself can be seen as societies and societal laws trying to replicate the natural law. But in truth, humanity doesn't know the whole of natural law, and probably never will. Yet, without understanding it wholly, we still agree to it and judge by it. And as the physicist constantly explores the nature of the physical universe with mathematics, despite the impossibility of eventually fully, totally understanding all of reality through it, also the philosopher seeks natural law and perpetually pushes for our constructed laws to better reflect the natural. The foundation of all philosophy, reason, and law is the need of the moral actor to know and perpetuate empathy. They seek to pursue their interests in a way that they can justify to others who also have their own interests to pursue. The intrinsic desire to justify ourselves to others and be seen as justified and to justify, that's all there is for us to know. For some philosophers, there is also the concept of the thing beyond even the natural. Call it the god behind the curtain, or call it Hindu Brahman, something totally unknowable despite being the highest definition of true. Our governmental and social contracts are attempts to understand the elephant. The natural is the elephant. The natural is the living universe, is motherland and grandfather Toghrul, who we seek to keep the laws of despite an inability to fully understand them. And we simply must strive to understand them as an effect of our empathy and our need to understand and be understood. Then there is the king who owns and understands everything about the elephant. Perhaps he created the elephant, who, as far as we understand, is simply unknowable to us. The things that existed even before the gods, or apart from them, in our creation stories. I suggest the novel What We Owe to Each Other by Professor T.M. Scanlon from Harvard. It takes an understanding of self and what is knowable, which is very similar to what we've discussed, then builds upon it to explore and answer what this looks like for our daily decision-making and for societies. While they were staunchly Catholic and so less open-minded in their presentation than Professor Scanlon, the minds of the Krakow Circle, especially of Professor Bochinski, made extensive attempts to illuminate the nature of the natural, with their writings deeply compelling to read, of course despite significant disagreements. Contemporary contractualism shares significant DNA with Catholic Thomism, which can serve as a more approachable introduction to these themes for viewers of religious backgrounds. But maybe my favorite example of what I'm trying to articulate about different perspectives on the elephant comes around the time of the Fifth Crusade, and I think a historical example where both groups are not necessarily directly connected to us modern viewers might help us step outside of the box and see the elephant, and then see how the people are viewing the elephant. So, at the time of the Fifth Crusade, the European powers who were leading the Crusades were facing a uphill battle. The previous Crusades had not gone as well as hoped, and they had lost their foothold in Egypt, and their expulsion from Egypt led to a catastrophic failure and crushing of the crusading armies. But as the Crusaders were near their total defeat, they had heard rumors from merchants who had come from the east. Many Christian merchants had fled from deeper into Persia. The people fleeing from Persia reported that Persia was being invaded by Christians from the east, that from the direction of roughly China or India, an ancient and previously not fully contacted Christian kingdom had joined the crusade and were coming to support the Crusaders to defeat the Muslims. and certain noble people in Europe believed that this Christian kingdom who was coming to save them was led by a certain King David, and that this mysterious King David of the East was either none other than Prester John or the descendant of Prester John. So who the hell is Prester John? It had been believed by certain Europeans for several centuries at this point that there was a Christian king somewhere in India named Prester John who had a kingdom in India. About a century before the Fifth Crusade, there was supposedly a letter sent from Prester John, the Christian king of all three Indias, to the Pope in hopes of creating an established connection between the Christendom of East and West. But the Pope had failed to contact this Prester John, sending a messenger who never returned with a reply. So upon hearing about crushing defeats being delivered to the Muslims in Persia along the region of near what is now Pakistan, the Christian leaders were eager to speculate that this was related to the Prester John that had been contacted previously, and the merchants fleeing the war zone reported things that confirmed this to them. As the mysterious invader crashed through Muslim land, they were ruthlessly, viciously executing and torturing Muslims, but they were sparing the Christians, allowing them to go free. So surely the invader was a Christian himself. Nobody reported that they belonged to any of the Chinese or Indian empires or kingdoms. So even though the invader was not able to catch up with the Crusaders, and just shortly after news arrived from the merchants, the Crusaders were pushed out of the Levant, an initiative led by the French attempted to make a diplomatic alliance with the invaders. But in time, it would become obvious that the invaders were not interested in such an alignment, that the invaders had spared the Christians only because the Christians were not materially in opposition to their goals. It turned out that this mysterious, allegedly Christian king, the mysterious King David, was of course none other than Genghis Khan. And in trying to understand how the great Mongolian conqueror was at first mistaken to be a Christian king, the famous merchant Marco Polo wrote his own theory about what happened, which I think is compelling. Marco Polo observed that early on in Genghis Khan's conquests, around the time that he self-proclaimed that title, before Genghis set out to conquer almost all of Eurasia, he had to begin by unifying the various Mongolian and Mongolian adjacent peoples of Central Asia. And of these many tribal people of the interior, while Genghis and the Mongolians who came to unify the Mongols belonged to their ancient animist ancestral religion of Tengrism, there were many religions in the Mongolian steppe because of the politics which had recently struck China. In the previous centuries, many Christians and Buddhists had made their homes in China, but had recently been expelled by a change in dynasties, and so many Chinese Christians and Buddhists fled to the Mongolian steppe and integrated with Mongolian tribes. Among these complicated fusions of cultures were a people called the Querents, and by the time that Genghis Khan was rising to power, the leader of the Querents was a man named Tughrul Khan, and Tughrul Khan is the man Marco Polo identifies with the original Prester John, claiming that Prester John, Tughrul Khan, was a real Christian leader who existed in the region of Mongolia, who refused to marry a relative to Genghis, and so was crushed and absorbed into his empire for it. While it's impossible to know whether Tughrul Khan was the individual specific man who inspired Prester John, Marco Polo was probably right on the dot in identifying that knowledge of the Chinese expelling many Christian refugees who then fled into Mongolia, probably traveled along trade routes over the decades, and knowledge of these Christian refugees would make its way to adjacent people, and then adjacent people, and adjacent people, before eventually reaching Europe. And it probably didn't help that the Chinese dynasty who had recently thrown out the Buddhists and Christians considered Christianity to be a sect of Buddhism. So depending who's telling the story and who you're talking to, some false equivalency could very easily be happening. If Christians were just a sect of Buddhists and India was the heartland of Buddhism, then sure, there probably was a Christian kingdom in India as far as China was concerned. And so, whether it was the case that somehow along the way Toghrul Khan became known as Prester, and when he was defeated by Genghis Khan, the title was somehow passed on to Genghis, or just accidentally associated because the same region had produced a guy who seemed to be coming to save the Crusaders, or whether something infinitely more complicated and unhinged happened that created this mess, the Europeans saw a very small portion of this elephant, and anyone who is in Mongolia or China more directly would have seen much more of the elephant. But we, in hindsight, can see more of the elephant because we have all of the pieces to compare. Though other people saw even less of the elephant. Ignoring Marco Polo's theory, many Europeans concluded that actually, instead of Asia, specifically instead of India, other Europeans concluded that John instead was actually the leader of Ethiopia, which led to European kings actually addressing the Ethiopian king as Prester John. It carries the same energy as writing a letter to King Santa Claus of Norway. So this whole probably 20 or 30 minute segment is all building to the parable of the elephant. You see one limb, I see another limb. Who you call Prester John, I call Toghrul Khan. Who you call Genghis Khan, I call Genghis Khan. And he calls King David. We all already know that what is a pet to some people is a food animal to other people's. What is a delicacy to one people is a valueless crop for livestock to other people. What is a normal amount of spice to me is terribly tasteless to an Indian national and is horrifically too spicy for an average American. I'm not trying to say that everything is relative in the hipster sense that we need to hold literally every single opinion as equally valid, but I'm saying that in the question of religion and science, I think that we ought to defer to science as the best tool for mapping the reality in which we live. The scientific method is a tool that is very good at understanding what we would call tangible reality, but I think that religion has its place for understanding what might be less immediately reachable parts of the elephant. I hope that makes sense. Okay, that was a whole soliloquy. Let's take a much simpler question next. People ask about topics surrounding the in-house flame, such as colors of candles, the type or material of candle, the matter of a grave candle within the home. I'm happy to give a little bit of insight. And this type of material practice, or specific material custom, will differ pretty drastically between specific places that you go. So for traditional candle materials, most candles in Poland would have been made out of beeswax for the wax. And the wick would have been made from any number of plants, but especially for holidays like Candlemas, they would have used a Zielona, or verbescum. While my grandmother was not a self-identifying polytheist, she was the dual-faith folk Catholicism, she would use the standard candles, which at that time, at least the ones that she got, were usually the animal fat candles, tallow. But nowadays, tallow has mostly been replaced by paraffin or soy. I've seen some blogs or websites online make a big deal out of whether you should use tallow, paraffin, or soy, or whether you should try to stick to beeswax as like the ideal traditional candle. For specifically the burning of candles as offerings, I don't think that the wax material is the most important part. Of course, the wax is just a substance that melts in time with the wick. The wick is the substance which is primarily being consumed, and that's why the wick is made out of sacred plants like Zielona. So if you're purchasing a mass-produced candle, I highly recommend getting a candle wick which is made out of a plant. Most often nowadays that will be cotton, but some cheaper candles will use a plastic wick, which I would not recommend. Basically, think about it like lighting the fire, how you don't want to use gasoline because that will not be a tasty offering. The plastic wick would not be a tasty offering. If you can only find paraffin wax, again, the wax is basically a substance that times the speed that the wick melts at, so I don't think that the wax being paraffin is the end of the world if you can't find a better substance. But if you can find soy or tallow, I think it would definitely be more pleasant. And as for absolutely non-traditional things like electric candles or oil candles, oil lamps, Personally, I don't think that an electric candle would be much of an offering because there isn't really a consumption being made. I think that it would be better to light some incense or something if you can't have a full open candle. If you don't have the opportunity to burn things inside, you can always go out to the park and light some incense. Go out to the park, light a candle. If someone asks you about it, you can just say it's a morning candle. And I don't see a problem with an oil lamp. It's not traditional, but the oil is actually being burned, and if it's a good animal fat or something pleasant, I think it could work as an offering. And specifically for using grave candles in the home, if you mean buying the, Roman Catholic grave candles and using those in the house, I think it's okay as long as you don't dedicate them to work as a grave candle beforehand. I think that if the father or the church made them for the grave, that the gods would probably be lenient in you repurposing them as long as you don't specifically dedicate them yourself. This is the type of compromise that I imagine probably happens a lot. But if you're asking about taking a grave candle that you've dedicated to the grave and then taking it inside to use for an offering inside, that would be taboo. This will be the question I like answering the least because I don't really like talking about these topics on here. The question is asked in many different ways, but basically it boils down to, wouldn't it be accurate to say that the ancient Slavs would adhere to insert political leaning here and would dislike you because you would fall under insert political leaning here? And much like the question about science versus religion, I feel I cannot answer the question as it's presented because I don't agree with the premise that it's being asked in. In order for somebody to assert that the ancient Slavs were far left or far right, that they were fascists or communists, these assertions are made with certain assumptions that will already vary culturally depending on which person is asserting this. The implications of being a communist will be drastically different depending on which country and which sub-movement within a country is making that accusation. On the face of it, my very factually oriented autistic brain wants to just pull up a list of the beliefs of far-right or far-left political parties and answer whether or not those beliefs apply, but I can't really do that because none of the beliefs are relevant to the ancient world. Look at the Polish far-left. Their main platforms are that they are against the LGBT, that they are pro a communist structure to the industrialized society. Look to the far-right. Their main things are that they are opposed to medical abortion, that they are in favor of restricting the modern industrialized border, that they are in favor of upholding Catholic values in a Catholically oriented state, and none of these ideas hold any relevance to the ancient Slavs. There is a general attitude nowadays from people more extreme on the political spectrum in either direction that they might propose that their ideas are more compatible with the past, but they only do this to lend themselves credibility. If they assert that things in the past were good, they will try to make themselves look like the past to say that they are good. In actuality, none of the provided political systems nowadays resemble the societies of the ancient Slavs. Whether you are far left or far right, nobody in the political spheres in Poland or Russia or Ukraine or America are having their parents arrange their marriages according with the input of the village matchmaker to ensure that both families are getting the best economic value out of marrying off their children. While there are a few people who do live that way in Slavic countries today, they are primarily village people who don't want anything to do with politics and usually don't show up for the election, or they're people like the Anastasians who are a bit extremist and weird and are not probably what you see yourself as or present yourself as. I will be very clear. Whether you are dating a woman and you're a man, or if you're dating a man and you're a man, if you're having sex outside of the marriage which is arranged by the matchmaker, then you are not being traditional. If you try to launder this into saying that straight marriages are traditional and homosexual marriages are not traditional, you're kind of missing the point if your straight marriage is not traditional, which it isn't. I am pretty confident in guessing that it isn't if you're leaving a comment on YouTube. So the people online who lead these arguments are generally not honestly interested in recreating the authentic ancient society. They are just interested in trying to steal the credibility of the ancient to endorse their modern politics. And they rely on people being generally uninformed on the past so that they can gesture to vague surface-level similarities. You can spin the ancient lifestyle to vaguely look like a Soviet commune or vaguely look like a fascist pasture homestead. If you aren't actually talking about the traditional lifestyle and you're just aesthetically emulating it, that's not the traditional lifestyle. And once again, the people in these countries who are still around living a mostly traditional lifestyle are generally not the people arguing on YouTube. The people arguing on YouTube are generally political extremists who are trying to push a narrative. And to be very honest, I want nothing to do with that. People have probably observed that I generally delete comments that get stuck in these ruts of this political arguing, and it's because it's just not constructive. It's not actually trying to say anything except come to my political party. It's advertising. I generally try not to say what my political leanings are. If you've assumed my political leanings, it reflects more about where you live than what my political leanings are. For example, if you deduce that I am gay and you believe that I must be a leftist or a communist because I'm gay, then you have never lived under the Soviet Union, or you have forgotten what it was like to live under the Soviet Union. The assumption that gayness has to do with communism is strictly a thing that came out of American politics. And I could go on, but I don't think I need to.
В Америку летите?
Да, переезжаю.
Америка самая свободная страна. Страна возможностей.
А вы с мужем летите?
Да, мы вместе. Он сейчас подойдет. А вот и мой муж. Знакомьтесь.
Эмили.
Простите, мистер. Пассажиры позади вас вегетарианцы. Им неприятно, что при них употребляют мясо.
Мы же их не заставляем тоже.
Простите, но в США принято придерживаться принципа демократии. Позвольте, я это заберу.
Парень, тут очередь в туалет.
What do you want?
В очередь говорю, вставь в туалет.
I want to go to the toilet.
Простите, мистер, что случилось?
Да вот парень без очереди лезет тут.
И что? Вы не хотите его пропустить?
Я?
Конечно, конечно. Его надо пропустить. Мы подождем.
Его народ долгие годы терпел притеснение белых. Мы перед всеми афроамериканцами в долгу. Простите нас, сэр.
Прошу вас.
But other folks have also asked, like, yes, obviously the modern politics don't apply to the past, but regarding certain specific issues, like, for example, the role of women in society or gay people in society, like, how did that look like in the past? And I could make an entire video about how gay people fit into society. I sort of touched on how women did in the WADA video, and I'll talk about it more in the Molkosh video, but just as it was broadly not uniform in the ancient Greek world, it was very much not uniform between the Slavs. And just on that basis, if someone is asserting like any one specific thing, then they're probably being very biased to a particular group in the past. Looking around, you can pretty confidently find places where men clearly had stronger authority, and places where men and women had very equal and split authority, not necessarily in a modern sense, but in a sense that managed to distribute authority in the village between men and women, even if the way it accomplished that wouldn't scale up to a modern industrialized society. For gay people, like I said, it could be a full video, but we do not have knowledge that Slavs had open homosexual marriages in the same sense that they did not have marriages for love, because marriages were arranged to produce children. Whether or not that means gay people had any opportunity to love other people is really a similar question to whether or not people who were not arranged to someone they loved had a chance to love someone else. It's hard to summarize for people who have not experienced it, but village life has a way of everybody knowing secrets, but also has a way of certain secrets being okay. If someone is a good enough person and gets along with the community well enough, then even if they have a taboo, there's a way that the village can forgive that taboo. You can see this most infamously, and there are a few memes about this that have crept onto the internet. Perhaps you might be aware of this, that in villages like this, if people get into a fight when they're drunk, then they'll make up and the next day they'll be okay. And if the cops come around to investigate what happened in the fight, nobody will tell the cops what happened because they don't want their buddies to get in trouble, so the cops just have to give up the investigation. And in this sense, I would not be surprised if there were people in the past who had homosexual relationships that the village knew about and did nothing about because the people were well liked in the community. And anybody watching this from that type of background might be able to think of someone in their community who that might apply to. And I also wouldn't be surprised if there were other gay people who were specifically targeted and punished because they were bad people, and that was a thing that they could be charged with. Basically, village life has less to do about specific grievances in that way, and more to do with your character as a whole, and whether or not someone got punished or not usually boiled down to their overall reputation in the community. I won't say what it was exactly, but my grandfather was a very respectable Polish man who had a private taboo, which nowadays would fall somewhere under the LGBT umbrella. I won't say what exactly for the sake of the privacy of the dead, but some of his friends knew. People in his community generally knew, and generally the people who loved him didn't always like that it applied to him. But much like someone you love who's struggling with alcohol or depression or something like that, people who loved him as part of their community saw through it because they loved him as part of the community and thought he was an honorable man. And that's not really modern concepts of social LGBT recognition and acceptance, but that type of social glue and forgiving of minor things is very important to the fabric of the kinds of communal societies as traditional Slavic culture. Okay, wow, do I yap. That was only like 5 questions and I'm already hitting the timer I set for myself, so I have big projects on my plate right now. I'm trying to finish up that first book of translated folklore and translated sources, which of course are taking longer than I anticipated because I'm being so obsessive and I keep adding more and more to them, and I need to just wrap them up. So the next scripted video in the style of the Vampiri video or the Bogovia video might not be until September, October, maybe even November. But I'll try to sneak another Q&A between now and then. I have a couple more questions I want to answer, which are much lighter and will fit in with a lighter video, and feel free to ask additional questions you might want answered here. It can really be whatever, anything pertaining to polytheism or folk tradition. Rest of the year plan, another Q&A video, hopefully one big scripted video, then getting a book out, and then maybe one more scripted video for the year. Wish me the best with that. And of course, I would like to give a generous thank you to our patrons on Patreon who enable us to get ever better sources, especially helpful for the polytheism D&D videos. Every single video, the credits list gets longer, and hopefully we can keep up that trajectory. We appreciate whatever financial help we've been able to get very sincerely. Thank you. And I hope everyone had a wonderful Peronica, the holiday that just recently wrapped up. And I hope everyone has, generally, some wonderful days in their near future.